this progressive vision of who gets educated and who gets educated as women too, and that there's a safe space for that to happen. So I think that was huge. And so then as you start opening the doors and having female lecturers, because Clara Mayer taught here, so you have women teaching here too, so they can have professions.
Clara Mayer devoted 40 years of her life to the institution and championed lifelong learning.
When Mark Larimore and I teach about New School history, we end up sort of lifting up the idea that Alvin Johnson represents a great man version of history, where people look to individuals who've been incredibly influential and that they are the ones who make the change happen. This is not all right for all sorts of reasons. It's always more than one person. That one person is operating within a network and within power structures. But what we like to do is utilize that great man version of history, because that's how he has been talked about in our past, to suggest that maybe we initially need a great woman of our past as well, and that's clearly Clara Mayer. So behind every great man is a great woman. Clara Mayer is absolutely that person at the New School. And I think over the last few years, through a lot of work by a lot of people, we've begun to shift the focus to recognize the importance of Clara Mayer in addition to Johnson. Again, we also need to recognize that there's lots of other women, there are lots of other men, there are lots of other people that are moving the New School and are shaping it.
Obstinate historical misogyny is in our midst all the time, every day. We know it, but what we don't know is how much we have internalized it and the ways in which we are agents of misogyny. And that's why I care so much about women of the past and their female biographies.
I met Eva Haller a couple of years ago. Eva Haller went to the New School in the 1950s, graduated with a BA, and one of the first people who greeted her and took an interest in her was Clara Mayer.
I mean, I just was interviewed by a little old lady with white hair, and she had braided hair like a crown on the top of her head, and she was sort of frail looking and very sweet and enormously interested in who this young person is.
Clara Mayer was a student of James Harvey Robinson, followed him downtown, and became a student at the New School, we think, very, very early on, probably 1919, 1920. And she seems to be the person who started a student group called New School Associates that was going to give students a voice in the ways in which the school operated. By the time that Alvin Johnson takes over as the first director of the school in 1922, she is his assistant. So within a few years, she already has a leading role representing students' voices, but also then implementing the vision of the director. She is involved in everything. You see her name everywhere. She's part of the board of the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences that Johnson is the managing director of. She is also clearly very important to making the University in Exile happen in 1933 and beyond. And she takes increasingly important roles that have different titles over the years, becoming eventually, I think they call her a vice dean and then a dean.
Eva also spent time with Clara outside of the New School and was invited to Clara's home several times for dinner. Well, she recognized the house years later when she was invited by Margie Loeb to a birthday party. She went up to the house, and I think she says this in her interview. She went up to the house, looked, and said, "I've been here before," and rang the doorbell, met Margie again, and said, "I know this house."
I was also so curious about Clara and her life. And now to actually meet a person who was in Clara's life. And Eva went on to explain how Clara was the dean of students, and that I independently knew that Clara and her family had, especially Clara, had salon-style dinners with sort of the most important, interesting, intellectual people of New York City of, you know, probably the 40s, 50s, 60s. I mean, Clara lived here until 1976, and that, you know, I read that in family letters, and then to meet, you know, to know Eva, who actually was at those dinners, was really quite remarkable.
She is clearly really the long-term history of the school, you know, the long-term tradition of the school. As Johnson eventually leaves in the mid-1940s and new presidents begin, she is still there. She is the connection to the Board of Trustees, we believe. Her family and her brother in particular is a member of the Board of Trustees. They are giving money throughout the first decades of the school. And so she is probably the most prominent person by 1960-61 when she gets fired by an incoming president. And it's an act that I think is a little hard to understand in retrospect, but I think is really about the power that she held.
At the end of his career as New School president, Alvin Johnson gave Mayer a copy of his autobiography, Pioneer's Progress, inscribed with the words, "To my co-founder." But as our librarian, Carmen Hendershot, put it, nothing like that level of credit appears in Johnson's book.
It's not as if people didn't know about her and didn't mention her in the past. And certainly when I talked to Jonathan Fanton, a former president here, he immediately knew who she was. But her memory fades. Memories about her fade pretty quickly, and I think there's several reasons for that. Even though Clara was here from the early 1920s, from what we understand, through the early 60s, there is no memorial to her, no building dedicated to her, no award in her name, no named professorship. It's rather shocking.